Okay. Hi, everyone. Sorry I couldn't do an actual meeting today, but I'll be giving a short lecture and we'll be letting you know your homework today. So we're just gonna continue lecturing on summary today. So just remember last week we talked about that a summary is a 3-minute speech summarizing the entire debate thus far. You must have a good flow in order to have a good summary because it's important that you know what arguments you need to go for and what things you need to clarify for your judge. You must extend offense and defense, but at least offense is the most important thing. And just remember, offense is anything that wins you the round. So this is things like turns and things from your case, right? Your contentions from your case. And these are reasons to vote for you. Defense are reasons to not vote for your opponents, right? It's not necessarily a reason to vote for you, but it's just disproving your opponents. For example, this can be an indict to their case. It could be like, like a D-link on their case. But just because you prove them wrong does not give the judge a reason to vote for you, right? And that's defense. Defense is also defense on your own case. So when your opponents are attacking your case and you defend against their case, that's also defense for you. And just make sure that when you're extending offense, especially from your case, you need to make sure you extend at least the link and the impact. So this is like, for example, if we're doing the US federal government should implement price controls on pharmaceutical industry, you would first say, oh, price controls decrease profits. Profits decrease innovation, which kills thousands of lives because we don't have these medicines. Like that would be the least you have to do, right? The link, which is price controls decrease profits, which decrease innovation, and then the impact, which is thousands of lives are lost because we don't have this life-saving drug. And then make sure you're also weighing. We'll also be going over that today. And then when you're extending defense, you have to signpost where on the flow you are. So are you on your case, your first, second, or third contention? And then when you go over to their case, or if you go from their case to your case, make sure you're signposting and saying, okay, now moving on to my case, or moving on to their case on their first contention, and then make sure you're doing that so the judges know where you're trying to go. The other thing is that whenever you extend a response that your partner said in rebuttal before, right? And usually it's always a good practice when you're in rebuttal to number your responses, right? So first, a non-unique on their first argument, blah, blah, blah. And then second, a D-link, and third, a turn. You would, like, when you're extending it, you would be, like, for example, they never respond to my partner's second response to their first contention about XYZ, right? So you kind of want to say, oh, they never respond to the second argument we made, which is blah, blah, blah. And then that allows the judge to like, oh, right, the second one, and they could just circle it and like bring it over. Okay, so here is a contention that I wrote a while back. And the argument is that the resolution was the US federal government should create a space force, which is like, people, military in the space, right? And basically you guys can pause this later and look at it, but basically it's just saying that like, oh, it's really expensive, and like the space force is not good, first because of politicization. Like the reason why it was created was literally because Trump wanted to be cool, and then we like wasted a lot of money on it, right? So the space force is a bad thing. And then second is replication. So basically like the Space Force does a lot of the things that other organizations does. For example, like the Air Force is doing some of the same things that the Space Force is doing. So we're just like wasting money again, right? So like, basically we're saying that the Space Force is expensive, which is why it isn't good. And then, so when we talk about extending offense, right, you can pre-write your extension so it's really, really fast. So the key to having a good extension is word economy, right? So making sure when you pre-write it, it allows you really to like just read it off the document and you can say it really fast. Obviously there are downsides, like you're less flexible in the way that you're going to structure your debate, but this can be really helpful when you're first like beginning to get ready to a debate. I always use like pre-written extensions. I think they're super helpful. And I would say this is one good example of a extension. So from the contention earlier, which you can read if you go back in this video and just pause it, I would say, okay, extend my contention one on price tag. Pope 20 quantifies the Space Force's budget doubled in 2020 and will continue to increase by hundreds of billions in the future. Worse, Thompson finds the Space Force just replicates everything the Air Force Space Command did, adding no unique value for a higher price tag, becoming a liability. As a result, Kunster 20 finds defense spending takes billions from housing, education, and medical investment budgets, underfunding our healthcare system, and leading to tens of thousands of unnecessary deaths. So I would just read that, and then I would go on to frontlining, and then I would like move on to their case after I'm done with our case, right? And obviously this is not like perfect. This can still be cut down a lot because it's very wordy, but this is just an example of like a pre-written extension you can write for something that is like, this long. Okay. The second thing I would say, actually, this is probably the most important thing that you're ever going to do in summary, right? The point of summary is to summarize everything, but you cannot talk about everything because you don't have that much time. You only have 3 minutes, which is why collapsing is really important, right? Collapsing just means going for 1 or 2 arguments. And there's a lot of different ways you can pick, but always make sure that you're going for some kind of offense, right? You need at least one piece of offense to win you the round, because if you don't have offense, there's no reason for the judge to vote for you. So let's say you have like 2 or 3 contentions on your case, right? So then you're thinking, okay, well, how am I supposed to pick like which one to collapse on? So there's a lot of ways to pick. I would say first, one of the like generally accepted ones is like least covered, right? Let's say they just like dropped your third contention. I mean, at that point you can say, okay, it's basically conceded, like you should just go for this, right? Or like they severely undercovered it. There's only like 1 or 2 responses, where the other ones they like layered a lot. So that's where you can also choose that contention. The second is like the least time. So sometimes you'll have like one contention that's really long and then one that's shorter because of the time skew. Then you can go for the one that's shorter and you can extend quicker, right? And if you do that, you can always go on to their case faster and like destroy their case if you can really quickly like just choose one of your contentions to extend. Third is the easiest to understand or explain. So something that you're really comfortable with. Let's say like throughout the debate, like throughout the entire competition, you've always gone for contention 1. Maybe that's what you're most comfortable with, right? So that could be a reason why you're going to choose that. Although I would say like it's a good idea that all your contentions are things that you can go for, right? So you wouldn't always want to be like just relying on one contention and the other ones are kind of like time sucks or whatever. Yeah, but so the easiest one to understand and explain for yourself, and you think you could really convince like a lay judge or like any judge that this is the argument to vote for. And then finally, you can also do the biggest impact. So sometimes you have one contention which like impacts to extinction, which is probably the biggest impact because everyone dies, versus like another contention which is just be like 10 million deaths, right? So perhaps you want the biggest impact. You want extinction, right? Like, oh, judge, we have the biggest impact. That's why you're always going to be looking to extinction first before you look to theirs, right? So these are just 4 ways you can collapse. There are obviously a lot of other things that you can take into account when you're trying to decide what to collapse on. And in the future, we'll do like a drill showing how there can be other strategic ways to know what to collapse on. But yeah, these are just 4 ways that you can collapse and decide which argument to go for on your side. Okay, the other thing is when you're extending offense, so when you're extending your case, right, or turns, but usually your case, you have to frontline. And frontline just means responding to what your opponent said on your case, right? So you can frontline before or after extensions, after you're extending your offense. Both ways work. But if you extend without frontlining, it's like useless. So maybe frontlining first is better, although personal preference really matters. I'm just so used to like extending first before frontlining that I always do it, right? So it really depends. But there's 2 ways that you can do it. So other than just like before and after, there's one way, which is, okay, I'm going to read my extension and then I'm going to like do the front lines before or after, right? Or you can like merge them together. So I'm going to do my front lines while I extend. For example, if they have like a D-link on my case, I'd be like, oh, judge, they tell you that price controls don't decrease profits, which is why innovation doesn't go down. But our case evidence specifically tells you that profits decrease by 40% because because like the cost of developing these drugs is so expensive that in the end they're going to turn to other things and cut their R&D budgets, which is why people are going to die, right? So I kind of like weaved the Frontline and my extension together. Like another example would be like, okay, on the uniqueness level, right? Like, oh, judge, they say generic drugs are really cheap right now, but they're missing the bigger picture, which is that 80% of the drugs that are the most life-saving are brand name drugs, which are completely funded through R&D. We would say that it's super important that you don't cut these prices, or else companies won't be able to make life-saving drugs. And then when you're frontlining, it's very, very important that you're grouping responses, which just means like a lot of the time, right? If they like spread a lot of responses on you, right? Let's say their second rebuttal or their first rebuttal, actually second rebuttal, right? They would go, defend their case really quickly and then go on to their case, your case, and they would layer a lot, like, 10 responses on one contention. Then you're like, there's no way for you to like defend all 10, right? But a lot of times when they have so many responses, a lot of them have the same links or like the same general idea. So you can like, oh, group their first 3 responses. It's all talking about how R&D doesn't cut, how price controls don't cut profits. But the opposite is true because like blah, 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 right? So when you group responses, it becomes a lot more efficient and you're able to respond to most of them. And then lastly, even if you don't extend an argument because you're collapsing, let's say you have 2 contentions, you chose the first contention, your second contention, you still have to address turns on it, right? Like if it's a D-link or like, non-unique, none of that matters, or impact mitigation, but you need to address turns because those are like offense for the other team, right? Like the other team could win off of that. So make sure you're addressing the turns, unless it's a fake turn, or if you have a lay judge. Like for a lay judge, it doesn't matter that much, but for tech judges, it matters a lot more. But for a fake turn, it's like sometimes they'll say things like, oh, just because price controls decrease R&D doesn't mean it's that bad. And they're like, that's a turn. And it's like obviously not a turn, right? Because that's like impact mitigation or like link mitigation, right? So sometimes they'll just say that. You just have to address it like, oh, judge, this not even a turn. Like just don't even look at it. Something like that, right? But make sure you need to frontline when you're trying to extend your own arguments. Okay, now we're at weighing, which is, so the first most important part is like round vision and collapsing when you're in a summary, right? Choosing what arguments matter the most, not only in terms of offense, but and also defense. The second most important part, I would say, is weighing, right? And weighing is really important because it allows you to win the round, even if you win only one argument, right? Weighing allows you to say, okay, judge, even if we take their case at full value, like, you can't strawman their argument, right? You have to say, okay, their argument is 100% true. We are still going to win because of this one argument, and here's why, right? And then you're telling them why. Why is it more important? So there's 3 different categories of weighing. We kind of talked about this, but the first is magnitude. So under magnitude, there's 3 like subcategories. First is scope, which is like the range of people you affect. So for example, they say if we raise taxes, people lose jobs, right, in the healthcare industry. But we would say when you raise taxes, everyone benefits because now you have like more funding for the government, right? So on a scope level, like we're affecting everyone, whereas they're only affecting the healthcare sector. And scope doesn't necessarily have to mean more people, although it usually does since it's a wider range, right? So it could be like, scope can be like, oh, they're only affecting America, whereas we're affecting like a smaller group of people, but across 50 countries and, in like Africa or like Asia, right? The second is magnitude. This is really easy, just numbers, right? Oh, we have 10 million, they have 5 million, we win on the numbers. Third is severity. So how bad is it? Like, for example, I would say dying is worse than being in poverty, right? So dying would be the more severe impact. The second main group is time frame. And here you have 4 subgroups. The first is cyclical time frame, which is basically like, oh, this is a cyclical impact. For example, things like poverty and racism are cyclical impacts. For example, like, when your parents are poor, it's more likely that you're going to grow up poor too, because you don't have access to like great education, or you're like not living through a very stable time, like maybe you're homeless part of the time, so you can't get a good education, it's hard for you to find a job, things like that. So poverty can be cyclical because parents affect their children. The same thing for like racism, right? Like if you have structural racism, like redlining, where it's hard for Black people to build wealth, their children are also going to be hurt by that, because like whereas the white parents are like passing on generations of wealth to their children, so their children have like money before they're even like taking on a job. Perhaps the Black families don't have that kind of money because of racism, or like racism in and of itself is kind of like a cyclical impact, because like the impact is like stacking over time, and it gets harder and harder to like remove, right, the longer it's there. So that's cyclical. Second is reversibility. This is so once again, for example, like, oh, always prefer human lives over the economy, because if someone's dead, you can't bring them out of the grave, but if the economy goes down, you can always bring it back up. Third is prerequisite. This one is something that's really, really powerful when it's done well. This is like, for example, if they're arguing about global warming and you're arguing about a recession, right? You have to say, oh, a recession is a prerequisite to solving global warming, because if we're in a recession and everyone's like stuck in this recession forever, then we're going to turn to like cheaper forms of energy, like coal and gas, instead of like renewables, which are good for the environment, because we're running out of money during a recession and people turn to like cheaper things. So you're never going to solve global warming without like solving this recession, right? The last one is long-term versus short-term. It can go both ways. So for example, oh, their impact is so short-term, like the GDP decreases 10% in the short term. But if you look at the long term, our GDP grows 100%. Obviously, they're like taking a cherry-picked example. You should look to the long term. You can also say short term is more important than long term. For example, like, oh, in the short term, if we do this, we will fall into a recession, which means we'll never see the long term benefits of whatever they're trying to tell you will happen, because we're going to be stuck in this recession and we need to like pour so much money to like get ourselves out of it. Third is the third main group is probability, and this is one of the most common and also another really powerful one if you do it well. There's three like subgroups. The first is clarity of link, and this is kind of like, or you could say like clarity of impact, clarity of link. This is kind of like iffy. It's like, is it really or is it not weighing? Some tech judges hate it, some tech judges are okay with it. So clarity of link is how well did you extend your link in your extensions during your summary and your final focus, right? So for example, if your opponents only said, oh, price controls decrease innovation, and that's bad because it kills lives, that's like such a plippy, there's like very low clarity of link. You don't know why price controls impact innovation. But if you said like, oh, price controls decrease the price of these drugs, which are growing every single year, now more people who couldn't afford it before can afford it, that's why millions of lives are saved, perhaps your clarity of link is a lot higher than their clarity of link. Okay, then there's also clarity of impact, which is like, oh, you don't know what their impact is. They never give you a number, whereas we give you a number. 10 million people are saved, right? So you should vote for us. This isn't like the best way of weighing, but to parent judges, this can be very convincing. At the end of the day, if you don't know what else to say, you might as well go for this. Like, they don't give you hard numbers. We give you hard numbers. That's why you should vote for us. This is very commonly done on the Washington Circuit. Okay, second is inherent probability, which is like, what is the real true probability outside of debate that this will happen? So let's say their impact is a nuclear war and your impact is like a conventional war, right? Which is just like no nukes. It's just like people on the ground and bombs and things like that, right? A nuclear war is like, the real probability of it is very low, because once a nuclear war starts, probably everyone's going to die, because like Russia and the US would get tangled in, and then like you have like millions of people dying. People don't want to go to nuclear war just because it's very hard to contain it. But the probability of conventional war is very high, because you see wars all the time, like Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, right? There's wars all the time. So the probability of like a war happening is much higher than the probability of a nuclear war ever happening in the real world. Then we have debate probability, which is how well did you debate this like link or this impact, and is it true, right? For example, they were like, oh, the probability of this is super high because my opponents conceded it. It's 100% probability, right? Sometimes a lot of teams say that because they didn't really, because you could have dropped it. That's like debate probability, like what happens in the round that affects the probability of your argument. Yeah. Okay. And the next level to this, right? The first step is just reading your weighing. Like, okay, this is more important than that because our numbers are bigger, right? Let's say, okay, we are more important than you because our probability is higher. So you have like your numbers are bigger and they have your probability is higher, right? What's really important, what really distinguishes a great debater from like a okay debater, right? This is like the bare minimum right now. You're just saying your argument. What distinguishes is when you go to the next level, and this will like get you so many rounds won because like judges need the comparison, right? You need to say, why is your weighing more important than their weighing? Like, let's say, oh, the risk of just killing 10 million people is so much more important than the probability of like this small impact, like 1 million people. We would say you're always going to like prefer 10 million people just because it's so big of an impact and it's very hard to like predict the probability of something, but we always know the real hard numbers, right? Versus like if you're a probability versus magnitude, like, oh, the probability is so much more important because like usually huge impacts like theirs are like completely skewed. It's like completely improbable. If we always look to like the biggest impact, you're ignoring these like smaller impacts that are also very important and very probable that you can solve. Voting for them is a shot in the dark. Voting for us is super clear. You should always prefer probability over magnitude. And that's like the next level of like debating. Okay, so kind of review everything that we're going to do. So first, in summary, first you need to determine what you're going to collapse on. Second, you're going to extend your contentions. And third, you're going to frontline, although frontline can come before extensions. Fourth, you're going to weigh. And then fifth, you're going to go on their case and extend defense. So it doesn't have to be in this order. You can like extend defense on their case first and then come back to your case. But this is kind of like listed in terms of importance, right? Collapsing is most important, and then you need to extend and frontline in order for you to have any offense at all. And then you need to weigh so that you can get like, so once you win your argument, you win the round. And then, defense is the last thing you should be thinking about. But yeah. So you guys can feel free to email me with any questions today. That is the lecture for today. And your homework is going to be on the contentions that you guys wrote before about the US should increase its use of organic agriculture. On the contentions you wrote, please write extensions for them, right? So kind of like this, write pre-written extensions, just really short versions of your case. And then the second thing I want you to do, and then when you guys are done with the extension, you could just send it in the Teams chat or reply to an email that I'll be sending out. The second thing I want you guys to do is finish watching this debate that we started last week. So remember, this debate was talking about the US federal government should replace means tested welfare with UBI, which just means like means tested welfare just means welfare for the poor. So like free money for poor people. This is things like
10 million American.
Oh, sorry. This is things like I don't know, like free healthcare for poor people or like unemployment benefit. No, not unemployment. Like free childcare for poor people. That means tested welfare, and then UBI is just giving money. It's like everyone regardless of their income. So Jeff Bezos would get a certain amount of money every month, and poor people would get a certain amount of money every month, and it's like the same amount. So like 1,200 every month, that would be to poor people, and Jeff Bezos would also get it. And usually this is for people 18 and over, right? So last time we watched constructive and rebuttals, and I want you to finish this video and then tell me who you think was the better debater. Like, who do you think won the round? Right? And then make sure you're also flowing because I'll be checking your flows. So flow on the same paper that you flowed on last week that I asked you to like keep, right? If you threw it away, just use a new piece of paper to flow the summary and the final focus. And then you can kind of get an idea of how a round should look. Yeah. Okay, so that's it. I'll be sending out the link to this video later in the email that you'll also get this meeting in. And yeah, thank you guys.